This was the Agnostic Agile Meetup event with Nabil Zawadi, embracing the resistance to change on the 16th of February.
Embracing the resistance to change. I think we hear resistance to change thrown around quite a lot, especially in regard to agile transformations. I don't think it's anything to be scared about. I don't think it's anything that negative. I think we can embrace it and work with it and help navigate the change. So a little bit about me. As Ivona kindly said, I'm an Agile coach. I'm a delivery specialist. I've been doing Agile for about 10 years now. I worked in various different industries such as pharma, healthcare, publishing, government, telecoms. Um, and I've had the pleasure of being part of some really interesting transformations, which is why I wanted to talk a bit about it today. So, a lot of agile transformations fail. According to a McKinsey survey in 2015, 74% of them can be classified as failures. I'm not sure if that number is specifically accurate. It's obviously just based on a McKinsey survey. But generally, when I look for data and look for how transformations perform, how agile transformations perform, there's a shocking number of them that fail. Um, some of the reasons cited that you're probably familiar with are things like resistance to change, lack of senior leadership buy-in, agile is at odds with the organizational culture, lack of skills to enact the change. So you've probably come across these terms before. Now, does it fail because agile or agility is really tough? Because it's very difficult? Maybe sometimes, but uh, also, sometimes it's not actually about agile, it's about the change that people go through as part of the agile transformation. Um, it's been widely said that one of the reasons that change fails is senior leaderships are not brought into the change, or they do not change along with the transformation journey. And I think knowing that is obviously a very good first step. But what can you do about it? What's your plan for dealing with it? A bad Scrum implementation is easy to spot, right? If your sprints are like 3 months or something, then it's a very visible indicator that maybe there's some room for improvement or things aren't working quite as intended. But resistance to change is a little bit less visible and potentially a lot more deadly. So I'm just going to give this short talk, maybe 30, 40 minutes, I think it should last, to give you some ideas about identifying it and how you can help tackle these failure points. I'll touch on some change models and some behavioral models that, again, we can use to sort of understand why we encounter resistance to change in agile transformations. So a bit of data on the failure points. This was the annual State of Agile report as of last year. And as you can see, the top two items are resistance to change and not enough leadership buy-in. So these two, according to this report, these are the two most common challenges experienced when adopting or scaling Agile. So I think, therefore, it's a pretty sensible precaution to have some sort of a plan in place to deal with these two most common failure points. And that's what we're going to focus in on today. And I wanted to talk a bit about it because, there's tons of information out there and other talks about how to scale agile well, or, some do's and don'ts, or, what a good scaled framework looks like and all of that jazz. But, that change is great, but that's not necessarily the hard part. So I want to try to focus a bit more on what I see as the difficult bits in a transformation, which is actually the journey you go on, not necessarily the end goal that you have in mind. And the conclusion I've come to in my research is that Agile is not enough. Agile has lots of great things in it. And I think increasingly, as the years go on, we're lumping more and more things under the Agile umbrella. I think Agile is increasingly becoming a behemoth that comprises of almost any and all things you find in technology. But I personally don't think Agile has all of the answers. I think it's a great starting point, but knowledge of Agile isn't enough to ensure the success of a transformation. I think change management offers some incredible ideas and solutions to ease the transition. I mean, that's kind of what that field is all about, right? Um, And ultimately, I think change management is a lot more appropriate to study up on in an agile transformation, because transformations are about change first and foremost. Agile is just one type of change. So there's a lot of change practices and models designed specifically to help you along the journey. So I don't think agile is enough, and we have to bring in other fields like change management to try to add it to our sort of toolbox of skills in a transformation. So what agile transformation means to people. Again, I don't think transformations are necessarily about where you want to get to. That's like the goal, but the whole transformation is about people. Then it's not just about where you want to go to, but it's about the people that you take on the journey. So naturally, I personally find it's very important to understand how people feel. So here I've got a couple boxes. On the left, we've got the status quo. So this is typically what people feel in a status quo environment where you're not going through a transformation. You've been doing things a certain way for quite a long time. And as a result, they feel familiar. It feels understood by people. You know how things work. You know the lay of the land. It feels safe as a result. It's easy and it's clear. Essentially, your world makes sense in the status quo because that's what you're accustomed to. That's what you're used to. What a transformation does is it kind of flips all of that on its head. All of a sudden, you're being asked to venture into the unknown, and what was once familiar becomes alien, and what was once well understood becomes uncertain, maybe fuzzy. And what was once safe and easy becomes scary and difficult. So I think in order to understand the resistance to change, having a people-centric and empathetic approach is needed. And keeping these feelings in mind at every step of your agile transformation and working to counterbalance them, I think is really key. Because again, and I'll be saying this a lot tonight, agile transformation is about people, not necessarily the end state that you're looking to get to. So before I start chucking some theoretical models at you, I just want to be clear that as this very endearing picture of Mr. Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I'm just going to go over a few different change models tonight. And, I don't take them all literally. I'm not sure if they're all scientifically validated or if they, hold up to scrutiny. But I do think that some of them are really useful, not to interpret literally, but to keep in mind as a way to sort of rationalize the context and the situation you're in, and to maybe, anchor your thinking in some theory and, some models that can help you understand what the right action is to take at a given time, or to make sense of the friction or resistance that you might encounter when you're doing your agile transformation. So all models are wrong, but some are quite useful. Okay, so thinking about the impact of agile change, I found it quite useful to understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This can really help you understand how the change might impact individuals going through the change. So I'm sure you guys have come across this before, but for those of you that haven't, there's several different levels to it. You've got the really basic stuff at the bottom, psychological needs. So like, food, warmth, rest, security needs, having a roof over your head, having an income so you can pay your bills. These are some basic needs that all humans need in order to feel fulfilled. Then you've got the psychological needs, which is belongingness, friendship groups, relationships. Above that, the esteemed. So this is where you feel good about something you've accomplished or that you're doing your job well. And according to Maslow, at the very top, self-actualization, which is achieving your full potential, because who doesn't want to fulfill their full potential, right? So when I think about an agile transformation, I think about which needs might be impacted by the individuals going through the transformation, and that quite often helps me understand and rationalize the resistance that I can get to it and some of the responses that you get to agile. So let's play out a little scenario to help us understand this better. let's say you're a middle manager going through an agile transformation. As part of Agile, we try to flatten the structure so there's less hierarchy, more autonomy, and cross functionality. And you may not see a clear role for yourself in this new world. So, what do you think? Which needs do you think might be impacted here? So, if I don't see a need, a role for myself in this new world, I might go as far as think that my safety need has been affected. So, I might not see a role for myself in the new world. I might not think I'll have a job in this new world because there's no like direct correlation between whatever the middle manager title was and whatever the new structure you're going to. Um, and some people may interpret this as the job is threatened. They might not have a job, or it will change so drastically they don't recognize it. And if someone does feel threatened about that kind of change, it doesn't matter if it's agile or whatever else the change might be. It's a threat to a very basic human need that they have. And obviously, that's really important to understand. Um, Even if there is a job for this person. So now let's pretend that you're told that you can transition into a new role. There's a clear path between this is what you're doing now, and we've understood your skills and we've mapped it to, or you've expressed interest in this kind of role, and we think there's a place for you as a scrum master or a release train engineer or whatever it might be in the new world. And that's a good step because it provides a bit more certainty and a bit more clarity, but it does also change the problem. So instead of having your safety basic need threatened, the problem kind of becomes now that you don't yet know how to do that role well, and you may risk potentially being bad at your job for a while, and that can also create resistance. So the needs that I would think is impacted now is more an esteem and self-actualization need. So someone who used to be very good at something before, had a certain set of skills that served them well in the past, is all of a sudden kind of obsolete or not needed anymore. Or to survive and thrive in this new world, they need a different set of skills. And again, no one wants to be bad at their job. So it can be very scary when you're told that you need to learn a whole bunch of new skills, or kind of worse, that the skills you have now aren't useful anymore. No one wants to come to the realization that what they're good at isn't needed anymore. So it can definitely threaten the top two levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is a really common one that I see because people have all sorts of anxiety towards learning new skills and they do it at different paces. And people have reputations to maintain. You want to be seen as someone who's good at your job in your peer circle at work. So when you're going through an agile transformation and your role is changing, that can be really scary to a lot of people, and that can create resistance. Um, so I remember I introduced agile at an organization a couple of years ago when I was working on a transformation. I was working with the developers, trying to help them become T-shaped people. So, picking up things that they wouldn't normally pick up, or do things they wouldn't normally do because previously they'd been very confined in their boxes. They only did development, nothing else. And I remember them almost biting my head off when I suggested or encouraged that they can do some testing, not just coding. Um, they hated it at first. They had a really negative reaction when I suggested that developers could do testing. And they were the developers were pointing at the testers saying it's their job. The testers were pointing back at the developers saying they're taking our jobs. And everyone was kind of scared. Everyone was, really uncertain about how this is going to play out. And I think it was because they didn't realize, well, because they weren't yet good at this new thing I was trying to help them become. They weren't yet good at being T-shaped people. And naturally they wanted to be good at their jobs. So having to pick up new skills and do things that they weren't accustomed to is quite scary. And I think they conflated the fear of uncertainty and potentially being bad at that new skill for a short while they learn it, and therefore maybe being a bit bad at their job, according to how they may interpret it. They conflated that with a dislike of agile. They were like, no, this doesn't work for us. And as a result, they didn't welcome the change. Obviously, I helped them through that journey, helped them understand that it's fine to go through a learning process, created the right environment for them to try it out and make sure there's no extenuous pressures on them while they're trying these new things out. And in the end, they really enjoyed it. They understood that sometimes it's helpful to contribute to a team in a way that's outside of your deep specialization. And sometimes being able to pick up some testing is more important on the team and organizational level than only sticking to your development tasks. So personally, what I've learned from this is that the source of resistance or reservations to change is not usually about Agile itself, but it's the change process that people go through. And another little theory that you guys are probably familiar with as well is Dan Pink's intrinsic motivators, mastery, autonomy, purpose. So in order to be intrinsically motivated at your job, he stipulates that these three values must be met. And if you're moving to a new agile world, and it's new and exciting and scary, you might have the purpose down. It might have been well explained to you why you need to do it, what the rationale is behind it. But as a result, some of your mastery might take a bit of a hit. You might not be very good at everything like you once were. And your autonomy might also take a bit of a hit because it's difficult to be autonomous when you don't have the right skills yet. So I think it's also worth understanding how your intrinsic motivators might be affected when you're asking a bunch of people to go through a change where they're not yet quite at that sort of proficiency yet. So communication and authority also plays a huge part in an agile transformation, and I think is a contributor to resistance to change and lack of buy-in. So on the left, we've got now, for the project management professionals among us, we know that one of the highest reasons for project failure is a lack of or poor communication. One of the highest reasons for project failure, according to many studies out there. And I think it's also a contribution factor to transformation failure. So how you communicate something as big and complex as a agile transformation is super, super important. So let's take a second to think about how your agile transformations have been communicated. How was it positioned? Who communicated it? Did anyone other than fancy agile external consultants play a part in communicating it? And I think this is really important because everyone interprets authority in different ways. And the people you have communicating your agile transformation and the goals and the updates and whatnot, they should have a certain level of credibility within the organization. Because I know that if someone from an external company came in and started telling me, we're going over in this direction, we're doing a whole bunch of new stuff, this is when it needs to be done by, I might not view that person as very credible. I don't know him or her. I don't have any relationship there. So this external factor coming in and dictating what direction we're going in might feel very strange to me. And as a result, I might not support that change. Was it a clear and clear and repeated message that was communicated? Now, you guys may have heard of the rule of 7. You've got to communicate something 7 times in 7 different ways in order for it to finally stick. This also super important. Something as big and complex and confusing as an agile transformation needs to be repeated. It needs to be, repeated in different ways, not just an email update. Do it in a workshop, do it as part of some interactive element, try to get the message out there in different ways to make sure that it lands. And importantly, was there a feedback loop? So I'm going to touch on this later as well, because I think it's really important, but communication should be 2 ways. You want to harness the collective knowledge of the people in your organization, not just to tell them what to do, but to invite them in to collaborate on what that change should look like. What problems are we currently facing? How can Agile or whatever else potentially address them? You want to design the change with the people going through the change. And that's one of the most important points for me about an Agile transformation, but I'll come to more of it later in a later slide. So if the answers to any of the above questions was no, or you didn't do it that much, then there's a pretty good chance that people may simply not understand what your agile transformation is trying to achieve. We can't take communication for granted. We can't just assume that people get it, and people get it at different rates. Some people may, you might have the early adopters who are on board with it straight away and start championing it and pioneering it. But then obviously you've got the less, not so early adopters, I forget the name of it. And you've got the laggards who come even later. And it's important to take everyone on this journey with you. And a lot of confusion can come from people simply not quite understanding why or what it is. And that confusion kind of festers and grows into something bigger than it could be, than if you just took the time to put a bit more effort into the communication. Again, going back to Dan Pink on the previous slide, one of the motivations is purpose. And if the purpose of the transformation isn't crystal clear, then it's not very surprising that we encounter resistance to change or a lack of leadership buy-in. So if the message or direction isn't clear, it can create unknowns, which in turn creates uncertainty, and subsequently could even create fear. And fear can be a very dangerous thing if left unmanaged. Now, little story. So imagine you have a fear of flying and you are going away on your favorite holiday. And I sincerely hope we can all do that soon, at least the people in the UK, because we've been in lockdown for so long. So there's not been any flying or holidays in like a year. But imagine in the future where COVID isn't a thing and we can actually go on holiday. You have a fear of flying, you encounter some turbulence, and you hear the pilot speak up and say, "Don't worry, guys, it's just a few bumps. We'll be out of it soon." All of a sudden, your fear is managed. You'll feel a bit better because you have been communicated that, it's expected and we'll be out of it soon. Now, imagine the same situation, except the pilot doesn't say anything. All of a sudden, in your head, your imagination is running wild, and you'll think that he's fighting for his life inside a burning cockpit, trying to stop the plane from crashing. And that's why communication is so important. It alleviates and manages fear and uncertainty. So that's a bit on communication. Authority is another interesting one that I wanted to highlight. So, ways of working isn't the only thing that changes in an agile transformation. Authority and influence shifts also. So with agile, if you're doing it in a good way, you might work to decentralize decisions. You might work to make decisions at a lower level. And these things can really shift how authority and influence is perceived in an organization. If your organization is political, which a lot of them are, wherein rank and hierarchy determines who gets to make the decisions and how much weight those decisions have, agile can be seen as a threat. It flattens structure, it pushes decisions to a lower level in order to achieve that pace and speed, and it follows an empirical process. So less about someone's opinion, more about trialing, seeing what works, and using that information to inform what you do next. All of these subtly and maybe imperceptibly shift authority and influence. And as we've seen with people like Donald Trump, shifts in power are not always welcomed, although I hope that you don't have to manage and work with those types of personalities too much in your transformation. But it can be very threatening to some people for sometimes understandable reasons, if that's what they're used to. And again, that's part of the helping people along the journey. I worked with a head of engineering about a year ago, where I was helping his department adopt Agile, and it wasn't a very large organization. So he was very accustomed to being involved in kind of the day-to-day decisions that the teams were making. He was super involved in helping them navigate and decide what to do next, and making a lot of decisions, essentially. Obviously, Agile comes in, and part of that is the team being autonomous to a degree, finding the right space for them to be autonomous in, and gradually building that autonomy to increasing levels as they become more competent. And with that, the head of engineering that I worked with, he kind of struggled for a while because he wasn't as close to the decisions. It wasn't always about what he said. It wasn't just that he would say, I think we should be doing this. He could give that input. Sorry, 1 second. He could give that input, but ultimately it was up to the team to decide what to do next. He was just another source of input. They had the most information, they had the learnings, they were in there in the code, so they were the right people to make a lot of the decisions. And he struggled with that. It was a bit of a change curve for him. And he resisted some of the ways we were trying to implement Agile as a result, because he felt threatened, because he was losing control over his engineering team. So part of my privilege of working with him was that I got to manage him through that journey, helping him understand that it's not about him having control over everything. It's not about him making decisions. It's about creating that environment for the teams to be autonomous and make their own decisions, and then dipping in and helping them when needed. So authority and influence can shift, and we should be really conscious of this and help manage the leaders who are used to these, a certain level of it through the change. And how you communicate all of your Agile transformation is super important. So what does resistance actually look like? Is someone going to stand up and shout, I resist your change? Probably not. It can happen in different ways. It can manifest in unexpected ways. It's not always so black and white. So these are some different ways that resistance might manifest itself. The silent is obviously silence. People might not always speak their mind. They might disagree. They might not like it. They might not see the value in it, but they won't necessarily say anything, or at least they won't say anything all the time. They'll speak at some points, I'm sure, but they'll be silent for a lot of the time. It's really important that, even though it's easy to ignore the silent group, that we don't, because just because someone isn't vocal at times or in workshops or when you're talking about the change doesn't mean that they won't be a force that goes against the change. So obviously these people will go back to the desks, they'll continue doing what they're doing, and they will either have side conversations or just won't work to adopt whatever the Agile transformation piece is. And this can all create resistance. So I find it's super important in this situation to create scenarios and situations where the silent can speak their mind. Workshops, anonymous surveys if they feel uncomfortable, because again, thinking about transformation as people, a lot of people feel differently and have different sort of preferences. Some people will happily raise their hand in a big meeting where you're talking about it and voice their opinion. Other people might be a bit shyer and prefer to do it offline or in a smaller group setting. So being conscious about people's preferences and trying to accommodate them as best they can, and creating situations where you have a range of sort of preference types that can speak their mind is super important. I found dealing with silent people works best in small groups with familiar actors. So again, a lot of transformations are accompanied by a lot of external people coming in and helping the transformation, because not every organization have the internal skill sets and manpower to deliver a transformation. But what you want to do is leverage the familiar people, like line managers, scrum masters, team leads, whatever it may be, leverage those existing relationships and use them as a driver for positive change. All of a sudden, someone that's a bit shy or someone who doesn't speak up as much, I personally think they're a lot more likely to speak up if the person doing the talking about the change is someone that they already have an existing positive relationship with. So leverage existing positive relationships in a transformation can help get that feedback and help people raise the concerns they have in an open and honest space. The middle type is the vocal type. Obviously, these people are easy to identify because they're quite loud. For me, I think my biggest tip here is that what they're vocal about might not necessarily be the real problem. So using empathy to understand their position, seeking to understand the root of their concerns and their issues is really important here. You may be in a session where you're, I don't know, talking about how your organization might use Scrum in the near future. and they may say they don't see the value in Scrum, or it won't work here, or we don't think, I don't think Scrum Masters are useful, let's not have them, or whatever it may be. And again, thinking back to what we discussed about Maslow and how different people may react to agile transformations and change in general, it might manifest, the resistance might manifest indirectly about a topic that's actually not the real problem. So taking the time to really engage with these people to understand the root of their problem and to understand the root of their cause, and having that empathetic relationship with them is really important to understand what their real concerns are, and then working to address that. I've seen many conversations get hung up on superficial things that no one really believes strongly in, because it turns out there are more underlying problems, more deep-rooted problems that people were experiencing that weren't necessarily front of mind or weren't as easy to, pipe up and discuss. So being empathetic and seeking to understand is really important to addressing the vocal type of resistance. Now, the third type, the saboteur, this is usually the guy that hovers behind you with a big knife, waiting to strike, proverbially, of course. So a saboteur they can be silent or vocal. Essentially, they can have the same concerns as someone else who's vocal or silent. They might not see the value in Agile. They might not understand the transformation. They might think the status quo is actually working perfectly fine. But the difference between this group of people and the other groups of people is that they'll a bit more consciously sow the seeds of discord and try to undermine efforts of the Agile transformation. And they might not do it in a very obvious way, or they might not even realize that they're doing it sometimes. But some people, like it or not, do almost consciously try to prevent us from getting to that place because they don't agree with it. And that the source of that might come from many different things. They might not understand it properly, again, because it hasn't been communicated. They may feel threatened as a result of it, but it is something that can happen and that we need to be aware of. I believe it's important not to isolate these people or try to silence them. That'll likely just amplify their negative feelings and fuel their actions. So again, an empathetic approach is really important, understanding the root problem about what's happening there, why they're feeling that way, and why they're acting out, so to speak. A nice phrase, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That can actually come in handy here, and in general to anyone who is against the change for one reason or another. So by giving people a participatory role in a transformation, you bring them closer to the heart of it. And as a result, you should increase the opportunities you have to change their mindsets and beliefs. Because if someone's pushed away in a corner and the transformation is just being done to them, the opportunity you have to change their mind lowers drastically. If you try to get them involved, try to get them to play whatever kind of, even if it's a super small part, have them play some sort of part in the transformation, obviously they become kind of part of the team. They have their little small area where they're contributing to, and that gives you more opportunities to try to change their mind or understand what real concerns they have. So that can be quite a useful technique to bringing your enemies closer and dealing with them there. So basically what I want you to take away from this slide is that resistance to change can manifest itself in different ways, and keeping this in mind will help you prepare a strategy and an approach to deal with each of these manifestations. So I'm going to go on to a couple change models now. I'm going to give you guys a super quick overview of a couple models with the intent that if you like it, you can go away and do some more research. Obviously, these models have a lot of depth to them, and we certainly don't have time to go over the details of all of them, but I think we can touch on it and it'll help us maybe rationalize some of the resistance to change. So the first one is by a chap called Kurt Lewin, the late Kurt Lewin, unfortunately. He's been sometimes dubbed the father of modern social psychology. He came up with this change model in the 1940s. Now, I think Lewin definitely knows a thing or two about change because he was actually exiled from his homeland in Germany in the 30s due to the political climate there. So this is definitely someone who's gone through a lot of rather significant change himself. And I think we can see some of that represented in his work. So just very quickly, his first step in his model for change is unfreeze. This is where inertia is beginning to be overcome and existing habits and mindsets are beginning to be broken down. And I like the analogy here of, he's obviously gone with ice that's frozen. Then the middle part is unfreezing it, and then you refreeze it later into the new form that it takes. So the beginning bit is actually unfreezing the status quo, essentially, breaking it down. The middle bit is the uncertain bit, the kind of the long, scary bit. That's the change. This is a period of confusion as the old ways of being are challenged, but as yet the future way of being is not quite clear. So this is where we may see some of the feelings that I had on the previous slide. People might think it's quite scary. It might be quite uncertain. It'll be difficult and fuzzy. It'll be alien. So this is where those feelings will be really amplified as people are stuck between both worlds and trying to sort of get to grips with what the new world would look like and how to get there. The last stage of Lewin's change model is to refreeze. So this is where mindsets and habits are beginning to be formed. They're beginning to take shape. People are starting to understand it more. They're starting to use the skills, the new skills that they're picking up and becoming more comfortable with it. And this is where we can see the change become more established. And a degree of psychological comfort is restored. Now, I highlighted psychological comfort because I believe the change process is a psychological process. Again, agile transformations are about people first and foremost, not just about frameworks or tools or all of that. It's about taking people on that journey. So understanding and appreciating that they'll go through some psychological comfort while they repattern and reorganize themselves. And keeping that in mind is really important to understand some of the responses we get from it. So what this tells me about a transformation is that it's not possible without first breaking down existing habits and mindsets. You can't refreeze into a triangle if your status quo is still frozen as a square. It's just not possible. If you see status quo mindsets and habits persisting, even though your transformation is progressing, it's probably an illusion. Your change is probably superficial. Until the behaviors and the mindsets change as well, you'll only change on a very superficial level. And I think this model helps to depict that. Okay, my second model for the day is Bridges' transition model. Again, the late William Bridges, who left us shortly a few years ago. He wrote a book in 1991 called Managing Transitions. So similar conceptually to Kurt Lewin, where he has endings, the neutral zone, and new beginnings. So I like the wording here. I like the fact that in order to transition to something new, we have to first start by understanding what's ending, what's dying. Certain habits and processes and ways of working are dying out before the new can be sort of born in its place. So the first phase of transition begins when people identify what they are losing and they learn how to manage these losses. They determine what's over, what's left behind, what they're keeping. And this could obviously be relationships, processes, locations, whatever it might be. So I quite like the phrase of, in order to begin a transformation, we need to accept that things are ending and manage those losses and the endings that go with it before we can move on. Neutral zone, again, this is the sticky bit in the middle where you've got a bit of the old persisting, you've only got a little bit of the new coming through, but you're not quite there yet. And you're sort of stuck between two places. So your mental model of the old world and the mental model of the new world, you're in between these two places. You're kind of in limbo. You're trying to figure it out. And it's when critical psychological realignments and repatternings take place. People are creating new processes. They're learning new things. They're learning what the new role is like. They're in a state of flux. And this is, again, where you see a lot of the confusion and distress and difficulty and haziness come in. But then we come out slightly better on the other side in new beginnings. So this is where we have new understandings, values, and attitudes. This is marked by a release of energy, which I really like. And a well-managed transition allows people to get into the new roles and understand their purpose and start contributing more effectively. So this is where they actually start to understand what it is. You've taken them on the journey, you've alleviated their fear, and that should be marked by an increase in energy and an increase in, just getting on with it and problem solving in a new way and really living and breathing agile in this case. One thing I wanted to point out is that Bridges actually distinguishes between change and transition. So for bridges, change is an external or internal event or situation that takes place. It's kind of like a new business strategy, a new style of leadership, a new product that you might be launching, and the organization focuses on the desired outcome that change will produce. I like it because the transition part of it is quite different and a lot more informative than just referring to everything as change. So for William Bridges, transition is the inner psychological process that people go through as they internalize and come to terms with the new situation that the change brings about. So if you're moving to agile, that could be the change. You're adopting a new framework or a new way of working, and you're changing some roles in the organization to fit it. That's the actual change. But separating it and understanding that there's a separate piece, which is the transition, and that's all about how you get there and the psychological process that people go through to get there. I think distinguishing between these two really helps you plan and navigate it better than if you just lumped it all together. So according to William Bridges, empathetic leaders recognize that change can put people in crisis, and the starting point for dealing with crisis and transition is not the outcome, but the endings that people have to leave behind that's caused by the new situation. So change will only be successful if leaders and organization address the transition that people experience during change, and supporting people through the transition rather than just pushing forward is really essential if the change is to work as planned. I wanted to call out this piece on Bridges' communication. So he has three pillars of communication, if you will, that I think are really sort of cover a lot of the basis that you'll want to cover when you're communicating your agile transformation. The first pillar is what will stay the same and what won't stay the same. This reassures and removes uncertainty. As I played out in the scenario earlier, if people have uncertainty, it can lead to fear and it can lead to all sorts of resistance that you don't want. So at least saying, here are the things that are going to change. Here are the things that are actually staying the same. That grounds people a bit. It reassures them, not everything is changing. There's actually a lot of stuff that's staying the same. And I think that's something that not a lot of organizations do. Even if it's obvious, it's worth mentioning that a lot of stuff sometimes stays the same in an agile transformation. And that's fine, right? Not literally everything has to change. And sometimes it's worth listing some of the really important bits because it alleviates and manages some of the fear that people might go through. All of a sudden, the whole world isn't changing. It's just these few things. And, we're going to work together on rolling those changes out. The other pillar is the rationale behind change. So this, of course, provides a clear vision and guide. Why are we doing this? It's essentially the why. So we don't want to just say, we're doing an agile transformation and it's got to be done by next year. We're saying, why do we have to do the agile transformation? What's the rationale behind it? Because again, going to Dan Pink's intrinsic motivators, if people don't understand the purpose, then they can get a bit lost and start to resist. And my third and favorite pillar is acknowledging the losses and honoring the past. This shows respect. Now, this is one of my favorite ones because the organization got to where it is at that point because the way they were doing things has actually worked really well up until that point. The status quo got us this far, and that's a great achievement. We're still in business, we're still growing, we're still expanding, we still got a huge team, whatever it might be. So the status quo, while we want to let go of it, I think it's really important to honor it because it got us this far. And in doing that, I think that it's not pushing some people aside or marginalizing them or saying their skills aren't needed anymore. It's kind of flipping it the other way and saying that was all really useful to get us to where we are now. But now we recognize that we need to do some things differently in order to be more successful. So acknowledging the losses and honoring the past, I find is a great way and a lovely way to show respect to what has come before you, and to respect the incredible amount of effort that everyone in the organization has put in to get to that point. And that helps you move forward with the transformation. So my takeaway with some of these change models in theory is that the first step is the hardest. Lewin's unfreeze, Bridges endings, they are very similar conceptually in the how they kick off. So for me, the theory is very clear. Until we begin to let go of the status quo, we cannot embrace change. It doesn't work. This is where I see the birth of fake agile, superficial agile, doing agile, but not being agile. I think the easy, above the iceberg stuff is adopted, can be adopted. But if you look a bit closer, or you wait long enough for climate change to melt the ice, revealing what's underneath, then you can see all the traditional behaviors, mindsets, and beliefs at play. Camouflaged waterfall is what I sometimes call it. I remember once I was kicking off a transformation about a couple of years ago, and we were partnering with a tech house, and we were all figuring out how we work together. And they had a proposal where they said, let's do it in an agile way. We're going to use SAFe. We're going to, be really iterative, really modern in our ways of working, full, lovely agile stuff. And they were using all the right keywords. Like, it kind of looked okay. But then when I dug a bit deeper, they had the scrum masters dictating the work to the development teams. They had development sprints and test sprints. They had the technical approach dictated to the engineering team. They were tracking people's time. I'm pretty sure there was a Gantt chart somewhere that just had, a list of all the sprints on them. So even though they had the visible artifacts of Agile, sort of above the surface stuff that looked okay, underneath it was still the unchanged traditional mindsets and beliefs that were at play. And these are the things that we need to look out for. You can't just use the buzzwords in Agile and say, okay, now we're Agile. Again, until you've accepted that things have to end, until you've unfrozen the status quo, which involves a lot more than just ways of working and frameworks, you're never going to achieve real change. So we've talked a lot about the status quo. How do we actually let go of it? An age-old Agile question. Create anxiety is one way to deal with it, apparently. But hear me out. I know anxiety has a bit of stigma attached to it. So another chap who is excitingly still with us today on planet Earth is Edgar Schein. He's really famous for his work on modeling organizational culture. He depicts it at 3 different levels. You've got the visible artifacts, which is kind of what we touched on, the norms and values, which is slightly underneath the surface, and then the hidden assumptions that an organization's culture believes to be true, which is the hardest part to get at to. So when you Google him, you'll probably find a lot on his organizational culture work. But within that, there's some really nice pieces on anxiety and how it can be used as a way to motivate behavior, which I really loved. So he describes 2 different anxieties. One is learning anxiety, and this comes from being afraid to try something new for fear that it will be too difficult, or that we'll look stupid in our attempt to try something new, or that we will simply, part from old habits that have worked well for us in the past. So again, letting go of the status quo. And I think we've all, or at least I've definitely experienced a whole ton of learning anxiety. And we've all experienced being incompetent at our skills. Especially during our younger development period, we actually spend a considerable amount of time being incompetent at things because it's just a big learning process. We all make mistakes, and we all experience an emotional penalty for these mistakes. We're sometimes criticized on it, and it could be absolutely anything here, from missing a shot in football to messing up a sprint planning session. All of this contributes to creating a learning anxiety. You're penalized for doing something poorly because you haven't yet had the time to become an expert at it. Naturally, we don't all experience this on the same level or in the same way. Some people it affects more strongly, others it doesn't affect much at all. So it's important to note that we all experience this a bit differently. But the result of this learning anxiety, I think, is really useful to understand why we might encounter resistance to change. With transformation comes a whole bunch of new learnings, and that comes with a whole bunch of baggage that people may have about learning new things. The other anxiety is survival anxiety. So this is the realization that to make it, you're going to have to change. Common examples are, a challenger organization has entered the market and is disrupting our business. And if we don't do anything about it, we're going to go out of business in 3 to 5 years. Or, some of the other examples we've talked about is the role that you were once doing for maybe a long time doesn't exist in this new world. That can threaten people's anxiety, their survival anxiety. So Shine describes these anxieties as constantly competing with each other. And he believes that we only see real change when the anxiety for survival outweighs the anxiety of learning. So it's kind of a balance that we have to strike. Shine depicts a few different ways to deal with it. So the first one is disconfirmation. So the status quo isn't working, here's why. So really letting people know why things are not working the way they're working now. And this is where we can bring in some of the stuff we talked about earlier to try to get across. Actively working to create a sense of survival anxiety. So this is quite interesting because, we don't normally think of ourselves as trying to actively create anxiety. But in this context, I think it can be quite a useful way to frame certain activities. So this can be as simple as saying, if we don't change now, we're going to go out of business. Or if we don't, change the way we operate and the way we deliver and the way we make decisions, we're going to keep getting further and further behind as a team or as an organization. And eventually it's going to get to a tipping point where, we can't change anymore. And all of our competitors they've completely blown us out of the water. That creates a degree of survival anxiety, right? It lets you know that if I don't do something about it now or really soon, I might not survive. The third point that Edgar Schein describes is creating psychological safety. Now, this is my favorite one because obviously we're talking about anxiety here, and we're talking about learning new things, and we're talking about two-way participatory communication during an agile transformation. I think for all of that to happen, we need to, and for transformations to be two-way, we need to build in feedback loops. And to build in feedback loops and to get people on board and to communicate with them openly, all of this requires psychological safety as a prerequisite almost. In order to have difficult conversations, in order for people to say, actually, I'm finding it difficult because I don't think any of my skills are useful anymore, and that's a scary prospect. In order for someone to open up with that, they need to be in a psychologically safe environment. Otherwise, they might keep it tucked in, and they might not speak their mind, and they might, go about being the silent type of resistance to change, which can be a slow but silent killer. So all of this requires a degree of psychological safety in order to make sure that people can speak up and be heard and be listened to. According to Shine, one way to help let go. So my takeaway from this is that, according to Shine, one way to help people let go of the status quo is to create survival anxiety. Another quick one is a sense of urgency. So you guys will probably be quite familiar with John Kotter, very famous in the change world. His first of 8 change steps is to create a sense of urgency. This ties in nicely for me with Shine's survival anxiety. And again, it all ties in really nicely to endings and unfreezing. So for me, the theory here is consistent. All of these very intelligent people give very similar advice. They just phrase it differently and they present the information differently. But essentially, we need to make sure that change has to happen now in order for us to be profitable or successful or whatever it may be, or to hit our, meet our outcomes. And that, before we can go about the change journey, that recognition needs to take place. And lastly, arguably most importantly, authorship over ownership. So I strongly believe that agile transformations are about people first and foremost, not about whatever the flavor of agile is that you're trying to get to. The difference between authorship and ownership is saying, okay, I've created the change, I've decided where we're going and what we're doing. I'm going to hand it over to you, you own it, you deliver it, and you tell me when it's done. I don't think that works because we shouldn't be doing transformation to people, right? So I think to succeed in your agile transformation, the people of the organization need to co-create what that change looks like. Transformation should be done with people, not to people. And I think there's a great movie that really depicts this point called Inception, which hopefully some of you have seen because it's an excellent film. The whole concept of Inception was, I can't remember the details, but like there was a son who was inheriting his father's empire, and the group of people wanted the son to change the way he breaks up the empire or something like that, or breaks up the company. Instead of just trying to coerce him or tell him that he needs to do that, the whole point of the film was that they need to make him think it's his idea. So they go inside his head, they play out the whole Inception film, which is thoroughly entertaining. And the end result is he actually thinks the change and the idea is coming from him. So he's much more likely to embody it, to believe in it, and to run with it. And I think the same concept applies here. If we give people of an organization authorship over the change, they'll be much more likely to spearhead it, to embrace it, and to, act as if it's part of what they want because they've helped to create it. So my final tip for you is authorship over ownership. So we've covered a whole bunch of stuff. We've covered why we encounter resistance to change and lack of buy-in. We covered what it may manifest as. We've covered when it might occur. And we've covered how we can respond to it. And on that, thank you. That is the end of my presentation.